Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. There are wars that nations build monuments to, and wars they quietly file away. The Philippine-American War belongs to the second category. It is rarely commemorated, seldom discussed, and often reduced to a footnote, if it is mentioned at all. Yet it was a conflict that scarred two societies, killed staggering numbers of civilians and soldiers, and forced the United States to confront an uncomfortable truth about itself at the dawn of the 20th century. This was not a clean war. It was not a war of liberation remembered fondly by both sides. It was a war that many historians estimate may have claimed as many as 1 million Filipino lives, most of them civilians, through combat, famine, and disease. It was a war in which American troops, men raised on stories of liberty and self-government, committed acts of pillage, torture, rape, and mass killing. And it was a war of imperial ambition driven not by self-defense, but by the desire to control territory, resources, and trade routes across Asia. For the United States, the Philippine-American War arrived at a dangerous moment in its history. The nation had recently emerged from the Spanish-American War flush with confidence, celebrating its rapid victory and newfound status as a global power. But the Philippines complicated that triumph. Unlike Cuba, the islands did not fit neatly into a narrative of liberation. The Filipinos had already been fighting for independence. They did not ask for new rulers. They did not invite American occupation. And that is why this war is so uncomfortable to remember. It exposes a contradiction at the heart of American identity. A country born in revolt against empire found itself barely a century later acting as an empire of its own. The Philippine-American War was not just about battles and generals. It was about race, power, and the moral cost of empire. It forced Americans to ask whether the ideals written into their Constitution applied only at home, or whether they meant something more. Many did not like the answers they found. At the time, the American government did not call this a war. It was officially labeled an insurrection, a word that stripped the Filipino resistance of legitimacy and reframed colonial conquest as internal policing. Language mattered. Calling it an insurrection made it easier to justify extreme measures, easier to dismiss civilian suffering, and easier to claim moral superiority. But to the people living through it, this was a war in every sense of the word. Villages burned, families were displaced, entire regions were subjected to collective punishment. Soldiers on both sides descended into brutality, shaped by fear, rage, and dehumanization. And while atrocities were committed by Filipino fighters as well, the imbalance of power meant the overwhelming weight of destruction fell upon the civilian population. Back in the United States, news of the conflict arrived in fragments, sanitized reports, official statements, and occasional leaks from soldiers who could no longer stay silent. When those letters reached newspapers, public outrage flared. Congressional investigations followed. And yet, even as the truth surfaced, powerful voices worked to bury it, to minimize it, to move on. This war makes the United States look bad. Not because Americans were uniquely cruel, but because they were human, capable of convincing themselves that domination could be disguised as duty and violence as necessity. Remembering this war is not about hatred or shame. It is about honesty. To understand how this happened, how allies became enemies, how liberation became occupation, we must return to the moment America arrived in the Philippines and to a revolution already underway before the first American warship ever appeared on the horizon. Long before American warships cut across the waters of the Pacific, the Philippines was already in motion. For more than 3 centuries, the archipelago had lived under Spanish colonial rule, governed from afar, its wealth extracted, its people classified and controlled. By the late 19th century, that system was decaying. Spain's empire was weakening, hollowed out by corruption, distance, and a growing inability to suppress resistance at its edges. In the Philippines, that resistance had already taken form. Filipino nationalism did not begin with American involvement. It had been growing quietly for decades, shaped by educated elites, reformist writers, and a widening awareness that Spanish rule offered little future beyond subjugation. Figures like José Rizal had challenged colonial authority not with arms at first, but with words, novels, and essays that exposed the cruelty and hypocrisy of imperial rule. His execution by Spanish authorities in 1896 turned him into a martyr and hardened revolutionary resolve. By the time open rebellion erupted, the movement was no longer merely intellectual. It was armed, organized, and spreading. Revolutionary groups coalesced under leaders who believed independence was no longer a distant dream, but an attainable goal. Among them was Emilio Aguinaldo, a young, ambitious revolutionary who rose quickly through the ranks. Charismatic and politically astute, Aguinaldo became a central figure in the struggle against Spain, commanding forces that steadily eroded colonial control across large portions of the islands. By the late 1890s, Spanish authority in the Philippines was collapsing. Outside of Manila and a handful of fortified positions, the countryside increasingly belonged to Filipino revolutionaries. Spanish troops were demoralized, overstretched, and isolated. The empire that had ruled the islands for generations was losing its grip, not because of foreign intervention, but because Filipinos were actively tearing it away. This context matters. When the United States entered the Philippines, it did not arrive in a vacuum. It stepped into an ongoing revolution, one that had already spilled blood and claimed sacrifices. To many Filipinos, independence was not theoretical. It had been fought for, village by village, province by province. Spain was not being saved from collapse, it was already falling. Yet from the American perspective, the Philippines was still spoken of as a Spanish possession. Strategic maps in Washington reduced thousands of islands to a single prize. The Filipino revolutionaries were rarely mentioned in official planning documents, except as an inconvenience, or worse, as a force to be managed once Spain was removed. This disconnect would prove fatal. Americans would later insist that they had liberated the Philippines from Spain. Filipinos would remember that they had nearly done so themselves. These competing narratives collided almost immediately, and once they did, reconciliation became nearly impossible. To the revolutionaries, foreign intervention carried promise and danger. There was hope that American involvement might hasten Spain's defeat. There was also fear, unspoken at first, that one empire might simply replace another. For the moment, necessity overruled suspicion. Spain was the enemy in front of them, and any ally against it was welcome. But alliances born of convenience rarely survive victory. As Spanish power crumbled, the unanswered question loomed larger with each passing day. Once Spain was gone, who would rule the Philippines? That question would be answered not by Filipinos alone, but by a steel fleet sailing westward across the Pacific, bearing the flag of a nation that had not yet decided whether it would remain a republic of ideals or become an empire of reach. In the early hours of April 30th, 1898, a small American fleet slipped silently into the waters of Manila Bay. The ships moved with purpose, their steel hulls cutting through the dark as they passed Spanish coastal defenses that barely stirred in response. At their head was Commodore George Dewey, a veteran officer who had been ordered to strike Spain's Pacific Fleet the moment war broke out between the United States and the Spanish Empire. The timing was no accident. The Spanish-American War had begun only days earlier, ignited by tensions in Cuba, but its consequences would be felt far beyond the Caribbean. For Washington, the Philippines were not an afterthought. They were a strategic calculation, an opportunity to cripple Spanish power overseas and secure a foothold in Asia. Dewey had been waiting in Hong Kong, his ships cold and ready, when the order finally came. At dawn on May 1st, Dewey gave the command to fire. What followed was less a battle than a demonstration of modern warfare overwhelming a decaying empire. The Spanish fleet, composed largely of wooden ships and outdated guns, stood little chance against American steel cruisers armed with rapid-fire artillery. Shot after shot tore through Spanish hulls. Fires spread. Ammunition stores exploded. By mid-morning, the Spanish squadron was annihilated. The casualty figures told the story with brutal clarity. Around 350 Spanish sailors were killed or wounded. The Americans lost no one in combat. Manila Bay became a symbol of the new age, industrial power crushing imperial relics. For the United States, it was a stunning victory, hailed at home as proof that the nation had arrived on the world stage. But beneath the triumph lay a deeper complication. Dewey had destroyed Spain's naval presence, but he had not captured Manila itself. The city remained under Spanish control, surrounded not by Americans, but by Filipino revolutionaries. Aguinaldo's forces already dominated much of the countryside, and Spanish authority beyond the city walls was evaporating by the day. Dewey understood this reality. He also understood that he did not have enough troops to occupy the city alone. So he waited, anchored in the bay, guns trained on the shore, while events on land continued to unfold without him. The Americans had won the sea, but they did not yet control the land. News of the victory raced across the Pacific. In the Philippines, it reached Emilio Aguinaldo in exile in Hong Kong. For Aguinaldo, Dewey's triumph appeared at first as a gift from fate. Spain's power had been shattered in a single morning. The revolution, long fought in fragments, suddenly had a powerful new ally. Or so it seemed. Arrangements were made for Aguinaldo's return. American ships transported him back to the Philippines, and Filipino forces surged with renewed confidence. Villages rose. Spanish garrisons surrendered. The revolution reignited with breathtaking speed. To many Filipinos, Dewey's arrival marked the beginning of the end of Spanish rule. To many Americans, it marked the beginning of something else entirely. Manila Bay was not just a battlefield victory, it was a doorway. And once opened, it would lead the United States far deeper into the Philippines than anyone had publicly admitted. At the time, the partnership between American officers and Filipino revolutionaries was uneasy, but functional. Each side believed it could shape the future to its own advantage. Each side believed the other would fall in line when the war was over. They could not both be right. Emilio Aguinaldo returned to the Philippines in May 1898 aboard an American ship, stepping once more onto the soil he had left behind in exile. To his supporters, his arrival felt like the return of a rightful leader at a moment of destiny. Spanish power was crumbling. The American fleet dominated Manila Bay, and the revolution, once scattered and suppressed, was surging back to life with astonishing speed. Aguinaldo moved quickly. He re-established contact with revolutionary commanders, issued proclamations, and reorganized Filipino forces into a more coherent army. Across Luzon and neighboring islands, Spanish garrisons surrendered or were overrun. Town after town fell into revolutionary hands. By early summer, Filipino forces controlled nearly the entire archipelago outside of Manila and a few isolated strongholds. The symbolism was unmistakable. On June 12, 1898, Aguinaldo declared Philippine independence, raising a new flag and proclaiming the birth of a sovereign nation. He soon established a revolutionary government, later styling himself as president. To many Filipinos, independence was no longer a hope. It was a reality being lived, defended, and celebrated. And yet, at the very center of this triumph, an invisible line was forming. American commanders did not recognize the new government. They did not attend independence ceremonies. They spoke instead in careful, ambiguous language, praising Filipino assistance while avoiding any acknowledgement of sovereignty. For the moment, cooperation continued. Filipino forces tightened their encirclement of Manila, cutting off more than 13,000 Spanish troops inside the city. Supplies dwindled, morale collapsed. It was Aguinaldo's army, not American infantry, that made Spanish resistance untenable. Thousands of Spanish prisoners were handed over to U.S. forces, reinforcing the sense among Filipinos that they were allies in a shared victory. But alliances forged in war often hide irreconcilable goals. To Aguinaldo and his followers, the Americans were temporary partners, useful, powerful, but ultimately expected to depart once Spain was defeated. To American officials, the Filipino army was an irregular force, tolerated for now, but never intended to inherit power. The tension deepened as foreign ships began appearing in the harbor. German warships arrived, their presence unmistakably opportunistic. European powers were watching the collapse of Spanish rule closely, eager to seize whatever advantage they could. Dewey, alarmed, telegraphed Washington requesting more troops, not to support Filipino independence, but to ensure that the United States, and not a rival empire, would control the Philippines. With each new American transport ship that arrived, the balance shifted. Filipino leaders noticed that American soldiers were landing in growing numbers, setting up camps, establishing authority, while Spanish forces, the supposed common enemy, remained boxed in but untouched. The revolution was succeeding faster than anyone had predicted. But success had created a dangerous pause. a moment when victory over Spain was certain, yet the future remained unresolved. Manila stood at the center of that uncertainty, a city surrounded by Filipino fighters, dominated at sea by Americans, and ruled, still nominally, by a dying Spanish administration. It was here, in this moment of shared triumph and silent distrust, that the revolution reached its most fragile point. Spain was about to fall. And when it did, the question would no longer be who defeated the old empire, but who would replace it. As the revolution surged across the countryside, the waters of Manila Bay filled with unfamiliar flags. Warships from foreign powers lingered just beyond the American fleet, their presence subtle but unmistakable. The collapse of Spanish authority had created a vacuum, and history had taught empires one lesson above all others. Vacuums never remain empty for long. Among the most conspicuous arrivals was the German Navy. Its officers moved confidently through the bay, testing boundaries, challenging protocol, and making no effort to conceal their interest. Germany, late to the imperial race but eager to expand, saw the Philippines as a potential prize, rich in resources and strategically placed along Asian trade routes. The sight of German ships unsettled both Americans and Filipinos, but for very different reasons. To Filipino revolutionaries, the message was chilling. Independence had been declared, territory controlled, and yet foreign powers still behaved as if the islands were unclaimed property. The struggle against Spain had been fought in the belief that victory would bring sovereignty. Now it appeared that sovereignty itself was negotiable, subject to the ambitions of distant capitals. For American commanders, the German presence triggered a different alarm. This was no longer simply a war against Spain, it was a contest for influence in the Pacific. Dewey sent urgent messages back to Washington, warning that if the United States did not act decisively, another empire would. His request was not for diplomats or mediators, but for troops, enough to assert unmistakable control. Within weeks, American reinforcements began arriving in force. Transport ships unloaded soldiers by the thousands. Camps expanded. Authority solidified. The Americans did not formally announce their intentions, but their actions spoke clearly enough. They were not preparing to leave. Filipino leaders watched this buildup with growing unease. The American presence was no longer limited to naval protection or symbolic partnership. It was becoming an occupation in all but name. Guards controlled key positions. Orders were issued without consultation. Filipino forces were praised when convenient and ignored when not. The German ships soon withdrew, deterred by the sheer scale of American reinforcement. But their brief appearance had already changed the trajectory of events. They had provided Washington with the justification it needed: control the Philippines now or risk losing them to another empire. This logic, framed as necessity, would soon harden into policy. American leaders began to speak not of alliance, but of responsibility. They argued that the Philippines were not ready for self-rule, that foreign threats made independence dangerous, that American control was temporary and benevolent. These arguments would be repeated often, but they rang hollow to those who had already fought and bled for freedom. What began as a cooperative struggle against Spain was transforming into something else entirely. The presence of rival empires had not merely accelerated American action, it had stripped away ambiguity. The Philippines were no longer just a battlefield. They were a prize. And once the language of prizes enters a war, independence becomes negotiable, alliances become expendable, and the line between liberation and conquest begins to disappear. By August 1898, Spanish authority in the Philippines had been reduced to a single isolated pocket, the walled city of Manila. Outside its gates, Filipino revolutionary forces waited, having already defeated or absorbed nearly every Spanish position beyond the capital. Inside, more than 13,000 Spanish troops sat trapped, low on supplies and morale, surrounded by an enemy they no longer believed they could defeat. The end was inevitable, but how it would end, and to whom Spain would surrender, was suddenly the most important question of the war. Spanish officials understood the danger. To surrender to the Filipino revolutionaries would mean acknowledging their legitimacy and effectively conceding independence. For Madrid, already humiliated by defeat, this was unacceptable. Spanish pride demanded that the Philippines be handed over to a civilized power, not to the former subjects who had overthrown them. Behind closed doors, a secret agreement was struck. Spanish Governor-General Fermín Jóvenes and American commanders arranged a carefully choreographed transfer of power. There would be a battle, but only in appearance. The Spanish would put up token resistance, enough to preserve honor, and then surrender Manila to the United States. Filipino forces, despite surrounding the city and having done most of the fighting, would be excluded entirely. On August 13, 1898, the so-called Mock Battle of Manila began. American and Spanish guns thundered, smoke rolled across the city, and shells exploded against fortifications. To observers, it looked like war. But beneath the noise, both sides were following a script. Spanish defenses collapsed with suspicious ease. American troops advanced with minimal resistance. Yet even staged wars kill real people. 19 Americans and 49 Spaniards died that day, men who believed they were fighting for their countries, unaware that the outcome had already been decided. When the firing stopped, Spanish officers formally surrendered Manila to the United States. Filipino troops positioned just outside the city were ordered to stay out. American soldiers took control of government buildings. The Filipino flag never flew over the capital. The betrayal was unmistakable. Aguinaldo and his commanders had expected to enter Manila as victors alongside their allies. Instead, they were treated as outsiders, useful until no longer needed. When Filipino units attempted to move closer, they were warned off at gunpoint. The city they had helped conquer was closed to them. The message soon became official. President William McKinley sent instructions declaring that there would be no joint occupation. The Philippines were now under American military authority, and all others were expected to recognize it. What had once been an alliance had, in a single day, transformed into domination. For Filipino revolutionaries, the mock battle of Manila was the moment trust collapsed. Spain had been defeated, yet independence had been stolen at the threshold. The war they believed they were winning had ended, only to be replaced by another they had never agreed to fight. For the United States, Manila marked a crossing point. Control of the city brought responsibility, power, and temptation. The question was no longer whether America would rule the Philippines, but whether it could justify doing so without betraying its own ideals. The guns had fallen silent, but the most dangerous phase of the conflict was just beginning. The mock battle of Manila ended Spanish rule, but it also forced the United States to confront a decision it had carefully avoided until now. With Manila under American control, the ambiguity of alliance vanished. The question was no longer whether the United States would shape the future of the Philippines, but how openly it would assert that power. From Washington, President William McKinley made the position unmistakably clear. There would be no joint occupation, no shared authority, no recognition of Filipino sovereignty. The American military would govern the islands, and all others were expected to submit to that reality. In a single directive, partnership gave way to command. To American officials, this was framed as order. The Philippines, they argued, were unstable, threatened by rival empires, divided by internal factions, unprepared for self-rule. American control was presented as temporary, necessary, even benevolent. It was the language of responsibility, not conquest. But to Filipino revolutionaries, the message was unmistakable. They were no longer allies. They were obstacles. Their independence, declared only weeks earlier, was being erased without negotiation. They had fought Spain for years, surrounded Manila, captured prisoners, and now found themselves barred from the very city whose fall they had made inevitable. Back in the United States, the shift ignited a fierce debate. Imperialists welcomed the move with enthusiasm. They saw the Philippines as a gateway to Asian markets, a naval foothold in the Pacific, and proof that America had joined the ranks of world powers. Senators and businessmen spoke openly of trade routes, resources, and influence, of prosperity flowing westward across the ocean. Others recoiled. Anti-imperialists warned that the occupation betrayed the nation's founding principles. They argued that ruling another people without consent was indistinguishable from the colonialism America had once resisted. Some asked how a republic built on self-government could justify denying it to others. The argument was not merely political, it was moral. Supporters of expansion spoke of duty, of uplift, of civilization. Opponents spoke of hypocrisy, of domination masked as generosity. Both sides claimed to defend American values. McKinley, for his part, traveled the country defending the occupation. He insisted that the United States had no choice, that abandoning the Philippines would invite chaos or foreign takeover. Control, he argued, was not exploitation, but protection. The islands would be guided towards self-rule under American supervision. To Filipinos, these promises rang hollow. Protection looked like occupation. Guidance looked like command. The language of empire had arrived, and with it, the certainty that independence would not be granted. It would have to be fought for again. By the end of 1898, the lines were drawn. Spain was gone. Germany had been deterred. And the United States had declared itself the new authority in the Philippines. The revolution had not ended. It had simply changed enemies. On December 10th, 1898, in a quiet room thousands of miles away from the islands in question, the fate of the Philippines was decided. American and Spanish diplomats signed the Treaty of Paris, formally ending the Spanish-American War. The document redrew maps, transferred territories, and declared the end of one empire's rule. But for the people of the Philippines, it marked something far more bitter, the moment their country was treated not as a nation, but as a commodity. Under the treaty's terms, Spain ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States and relinquished its claim to Cuba. The Philippines, however, were handled differently. Rather than acknowledging Filipino independence, Spain agreed to sell the archipelago to the United States for $20 million, roughly the cost of settling outstanding claims and compensating Spain for its lost infrastructure. In modern terms, it amounted to hundreds of millions of dollars. Not a single Filipino representative was present at the negotiations. The revolutionaries who had fought Spain for years, declared independence, and governed most of the countryside were never invited to speak. Their fate was decided without their consent, their voices erased from the room as if they did not exist. To American officials, the transaction was legal, orderly, and pragmatic. Spain had sovereignty, Spain could transfer sovereignty, and the United States had now lawfully acquired the islands. To Filipinos, it was a betrayal layered upon betrayal. They had not been conquered by Spain at the negotiating table. They had defeated Spain on the ground. Yet Spain claimed the right to sell a country it no longer controlled. News of the treaty spread quickly through the Philippines, and with it, fury and disbelief. Independence, proclaimed only months earlier, had been nullified by ink on paper signed an ocean away. The revolution that had been paused in uneasy cooperation now reignited with a new clarity of purpose. In the United States, ratifying the treaty sparked one of the most intense political debates in the nation's history. The Senate narrowly approved it, but not without fierce opposition. Anti-imperialists argued that buying the Philippines contradicted everything the United States claimed to stand for. They asked how a nation born in rebellion against colonial rule could justify acquiring colonies of its own. Among the loudest critics was Mark Twain, who wrote with scathing clarity that the treaty revealed America's true intentions, not liberation, but domination. To Twain and others, the language of uplift and protection masked a simpler truth. The United States was choosing empire. Supporters of the treaty countered with fear and ambition. If America did not take the Philippines, they argued, Germany or Japan would. Better American rule than foreign domination. Better order than chaos. Better guidance than independence too soon. These arguments, repeated often, framed imperial control as a reluctant necessity rather than a deliberate choice. For Filipinos, the debate in Washington mattered little. The result was the same. Their homeland had been sold without consent, their independence denied by a signature they never saw. The Treaty of Paris did not end a war for the Philippines. It ensured that another would begin. The ink on the Treaty of Paris was barely dry when the United States turned inward, gripped by a debate that cut across politics, class, and conscience. The Philippines had been acquired, but the meaning of that acquisition was far from settled. What, exactly, had America become? For imperialists, the answer was exhilarating. They spoke the language of destiny and opportunity. The Philippines, they argued, offered a gateway to Asia, new markets, naval bases, and strategic reach across the Pacific. Trade would flourish. American power would be secured. The nation, once confined to a continent, would now stand among the great empires of the world. Some framed this expansion as progress itself, the natural evolution of a rising power. Others framed it as obligation, They claimed the United States had a duty to govern the Philippines for the Filipinos' own good, to bring stability, education, and civilization. Independence, they warned, would lead to chaos, foreign invasion, or internal collapse. Better, they said, that America rule benevolently than abandon the islands to uncertainty. But a powerful opposition rose in response. Anti-imperialists came from across the political spectrum. Former abolitionists, labor leaders, religious figures, and veterans of the Civil War who believed the nation had already paid dearly for the principle of self-rule. They saw in the Philippines not opportunity, but hypocrisy. Their argument was stark. A republic built on consent could not govern another people without theirs. To deny Filipinos independence was to deny the very ideals the United States claimed as universal. The anti-imperialists warned that empire abroad would corrupt democracy at home. The conquest required coercion, racism, and repression, all of which would eventually seep back into American society. Mark Twain became one of their most eloquent voices. Once an enthusiastic supporter of the Spanish-American War, he reversed himself when he realized its outcome. He wrote that the United States had gone to the Philippines not to free its people, but to subjugate them, to conquer, not to redeem. His words stung because they stripped away euphemism and laid bare the moral cost of empire. The debate was not theoretical. Even as politicians argued in Washington, American soldiers were landing in the Philippines, building forts, and enforcing authority. Filipino revolutionaries watched closely, recognizing that their future was being discussed by people who had never seen their villages, never heard their language, never asked their consent. President McKinley stood firm. He insisted that annexation was unavoidable, that America had a responsibility to govern until the Filipinos were ready to govern themselves. His speeches reassured some, angered others, and convinced few of those who mattered most, the people whose country was now occupied. By early 1899, the divide was clear. In the Philippines, resentment hardened into resistance. In the United States, idealism clashed with ambition. The nation had chosen empire, but not unanimously, and not without doubt. That doubt would soon be tested by gunfire. By the winter of 1899, Manila was a city under strain. American troops patrolled its streets and manned its checkpoints, enforcing an authority that had never been negotiated, only declared. Just beyond the lines, Filipino soldiers waited, former allies now treated as outsiders, their presence tolerated only at a distance. Between them lay fear, resentment, and a silence heavy with inevitability. On the night of February 4th, 1899, that silence broke. An American sentry fired on a Filipino soldier near a bridge on the outskirts of the city. Accounts differed on what happened next, whether the Filipino advanced too close, whether warnings were misunderstood, whether the shot was fired in panic or suspicion. But the details hardly mattered. Within hours, gunfire rippled across Manila's perimeter as both sides poured men into the fight. By morning, the uneasy peace was gone. The war that had been postponed by diplomacy and denial had begun in earnest. Emilio Aguinaldo issued a proclamation declaring that peace with the Americans was broken and that U.S. forces were now enemies, to be resisted within the limits of the laws of war. What had started as a skirmish had ignited a national uprising. The first major engagement, the Battle of Manila, unfolded over the next day and a half. American forces, better armed and more organized, pressed outward with artillery and coordinated assaults. Filipino troops fought back fiercely, but the imbalance was stark. When the fighting subsided, the casualty figures told a grim story. 55 Americans killed, and more than 200 Filipino soldiers dead, with many more wounded. General Elwell Stephen Otis, the American military governor, rejected Filipino attempts to negotiate a truce. The conflict was framed as an insurrection to be crushed, not a war between nations. That framing carried consequences. It stripped the Filipino cause of legitimacy in American eyes and set the tone for a campaign that would soon abandon restraint. In the days that followed, American troops pushed Filipino forces out of Manila and into the surrounding countryside. Conventional battles favored the United States. Rifles, machine guns, and artillery overwhelmed units armed in many cases with little more than outdated firearms or improvised weapons. American commanders reported swift successes and predicted a short war. They were wrong. As the Filipino army withdrew, It did not dissolve. Instead, it adapted. Aguinaldo and his commanders recognized that meeting the Americans head-on would only lead to annihilation. The terrain offered another option, one that had defeated empires before. If the Americans controlled the cities and roads, the revolution would live in the villages, forests, and mountains beyond their reach. February 4th did not simply begin a war. It transformed its nature. What the United States believed would be a brief campaign to assert order was about to become a grinding struggle against an enemy that refused to disappear. The spark in Manila had lit a fire that would spread across the archipelago and consume far more than anyone was prepared to admit. In the opening months of the conflict, the imbalance was impossible to ignore. The United States fought the war it knew best: columns advancing along roads, artillery softening positions, rifle fire sweeping open ground. Against this, the Filipino army stood brave but unevenly equipped. Many of Aguinaldo's soldiers had never received formal training. Some carried aging rifles with scarce ammunition. Others relied on bolos, spears, bows, or whatever weapons could be found. Courage was abundant. Firepower was not. American commanders interpreted early victories as confirmation that the war would be short. Engagement after engagement ended the same way. Filipino units held briefly, then broke under sustained fire. Towns fell. Supply routes opened. Reports sent back to Washington spoke of progress and order restored. The language of inevitability crept into official correspondence. Yet beneath these reports lay a growing unease. Victory on the battlefield did not translate into control beyond it. Each time American forces moved forward, Filipino fighters slipped away, avoiding encirclement and refusing annihilation. The revolution did not collapse. It receded, regrouped, and returned. For Aguinaldo, the lesson was clear. Conventional war favored the occupier. If the revolution continued to fight as an army of lines and camps, it would be destroyed. Survival required transformation. Orders went out to abandon large formations, to dissolve into smaller units, to blend into the terrain and population. The war would no longer be fought for territory. It would be fought for time. This shift was not ideological. It was born of necessity. The Filipino leadership understood that they could not match American industry, logistics, or reinforcements. But they could exploit the Americans' unfamiliarity with the land, their dependence on supply lines, and their growing mistrust of a population that refused to submit. As Filipino units dispersed, the battlefield changed. Ambushes replaced set-piece engagements. Patrols vanished into jungle paths. Outposts were harassed at night. American soldiers found themselves firing into forests where the enemy could not be seen, only felt. The psychological toll began to mount. To American troops, the war grew confusing and frightening. The enemy wore no uniform. A farmer by day could be a fighter by night. Villages that seemed peaceful one week erupted in violence the next. Trust eroded quickly, and with it, restraint. What had begun as a conventional campaign of conquest was transforming into something far darker. Guns had crushed spears in open battle, but in the shadows, the spears learned to strike where guns were weakest. The war was no longer about winning battles. It was about breaking wills. The transition from conventional war to guerrilla struggle did not happen by accident. It was driven by men who understood that survival required reinvention. Among them, none loomed larger, or more dangerously, than General Antonio Luna. Luna was unlike most revolutionary leaders. Educated in Europe, trained in military science, and fiercely disciplined, he believed that independence could not be won through passion alone. He demanded order, training, and obedience, even when resources were scarce and morale was fragile. To his followers, he was brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. To his enemies, he was a nightmare. Under Luna's guidance, Filipino forces reorganized into mobile units designed for ambush and disruption. Roads became killing zones. Patrols vanished without warning. Small American detachments were attacked, then dissolved back into the landscape. Luna's elite sharpshooters, some of the few Filipino soldiers equipped with modern rifles, earned a grim reputation. American troops called them the marksmen of death, a name that reflected both their accuracy and the fear they inspired. This new phase of the war struck at the Americans' greatest weakness: uncertainty. Guerrilla warfare blurred every boundary. The enemy no longer stood in formation or announced his presence. He appeared suddenly, struck hard, and vanished. Soldiers slept lightly, if at all. Every village felt hostile. Every face seemed suspect. For American commanders, the frustration was immediate and corrosive. Traditional doctrine offered little guidance. Victories could no longer be measured by ground taken or enemies killed because the enemy refused to stand and fight. Instead, the war became an endless series of patrols, reprisals, and reprisals for reprisals. As fear mounted, discipline began to fray. Soldiers who could not identify their attackers began to suspect everyone. Civilians, once viewed as bystanders, were increasingly seen as collaborators. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant, already fragile, started to collapse. Luna's effectiveness made him both invaluable and dangerous. His insistence on strict discipline clashed with the political leadership around Aguinaldo, many of whom feared his power and resented his authority. Internal rivalries deepened, even as the external enemy pressed harder. Then, in June 1899, the revolution suffered a devastating blow. Antonio Luna was assassinated, not by Americans, but by members of Aguinaldo's own faction. The killing shocked the movement. Its most capable general, the architect of its most effective strategy, was gone. For the Filipino resistance, Luna's death was catastrophic. Guerrilla warfare would continue, but without the unifying force that had held it together. For the Americans, the loss removed their most dangerous opponent, but it did not end the war. By then, the cycle of violence had already taken on a life of its own. The guerrilla turn had changed everything. The conflict was no longer about defeating an army. It was about controlling a population through fear, force, and exhaustion. And once a war reaches that stage, restraint becomes the first casualty. With Antonio Luna gone, the Filipino resistance fractured but did not disappear. What followed was not peace, but a descent into a harsher, more punishing phase of war, one defined less by battles than by policies. American commanders, exhausted by ambushes and uncertain loyalties, began to adopt measures designed not merely to defeat fighters, but to suffocate the rebellion at its roots. Trust had collapsed. Guerrilla warfare had erased clear front lines, and with them, the distinction between combatant and civilian. American patrols moved through villages where smiles could mask warning signals, where food might be shared by day and fighters sheltered by night. Each ambush reinforced the belief that the population itself was the battlefield. In response, American forces turned to collective punishment. Crops were burned, livestock slaughtered. Food supplies were seized or destroyed to deny guerrillas sustenance. Entire villages were leveled as a warning to others. What could not be controlled would be erased. These scorched earth campaigns were not always centrally planned. Often they were the product of frustration, fear, and revenge carried out by units far from oversight. The most devastating measure was relocation. Civilians were forcibly moved from their homes into guarded zones, what officials called reconcentration areas. These camps were intended to separate fighters from the population that sustained them. In practice, they became sites of suffering on a massive scale. Overcrowded, unsanitary, and undersupplied, they bred disease and hunger. Cholera and dysentery spread rapidly. Thousands died, not by bullets, but by neglect. The language used to justify these camps was clinical and detached. They were described as necessary, temporary, protective. But to those inside them, they were prisons. Families were torn apart. Livelihoods destroyed. Communities dissolved under the weight of forced confinement. The war was no longer being fought only in forests and fields. It was being waged against daily life itself. American soldiers were not immune to the toll. Many arrived believing they were agents of order and progress. Months later, they found themselves guarding camps filled with starving civilians or burning villages whose inhabitants they could not distinguish as friend or foe. Letters home grew darker. Some soldiers confessed horror at what they were ordered or permitted to do. Others hardened, embracing brutality as survival. The moral center of the war was eroding. Policies designed to break resistance instead deepened resentment. Each act of collective punishment created new grievances, new fighters, new reasons to resist. The cycle fed itself. By the end of 1900, the Philippine-American War had become something far removed from its original justification. It was no longer about ending Spanish rule or ensuring stability. It was about control, exercised through fear, deprivation, and force. And as the war darkened, voices within the American ranks began to ask a dangerous question. In trying to crush the rebellion, what exactly had they become? As the war dragged into its second year, the violence took on a more intimate and disturbing character. No longer confined to firefights and burned villages, it entered interrogation rooms, makeshift prisons, and quiet clearings far from any battlefield. This was the phase of the war that would haunt American memory most deeply, because it revealed not just what was being done, but how it was justified. Among the most infamous practices was torture. American soldiers, desperate for intelligence and increasingly convinced that every civilian might be an insurgent, resorted to methods that even some of their own officers would later condemn. The most notorious was known as the water cure. Prisoners were restrained, their mouths forced open, water poured in until their stomachs swelled painfully. If they did not speak, salt was sometimes added to intensify the agony. When the water was released, the process could begin again. One documented case involved a Filipino mayor subjected to this treatment until he broke. Testimony later revealed how the procedure was carried out calmly, methodically, as if it were merely another tool of war. The details shocked those who read them, both then and now, not because torture was unheard of in history, but because it was being practiced by a nation that claimed moral superiority. Atrocities were not limited to interrogations. There were reports of soldiers looting villages of anything valuable, of civilians beaten or raped, of summary executions carried out in retaliation for ambushes. Entire towns were sometimes destroyed after American troops suffered casualties nearby. In one chilling account, a soldier described orders to burn a town and kill every native in sight after an American body was found mutilated. Thousands of men, women, and children were reported dead. It is crucial to say this clearly. Most American soldiers were not monsters. Many were deeply disturbed by what they witnessed, and some refused to stay silent. Letters began to appear in newspapers back home, first cautiously, then in growing numbers. Soldiers wrote of burned villages, of torture, of orders that violated everything they believed America stood for. One admitted that he was growing hard-hearted, finding himself exhilarated by killing, a confession that horrified readers and revealed how war reshapes those trapped inside it. Public reaction in the United States was swift and angry. Newspapers published the letters. Churches and civic groups protested. Congress launched investigations into the conduct of the war. For the first time, the official narrative of benevolent occupation began to crack under the weight of first-hand testimony. American military authorities responded not with transparency, but with suppression. The military governor launched a public relations campaign to downplay the reports, dismissing them as exaggerations or lies. Soldiers who had written to the press were tracked down. Some were forced to recant. Others were threatened with court-martial. The goal was clear: contain the damage, restore control of the story. Yet even senior officers began to speak out. One general wrote that the conduct of the war seemed fundamentally at odds with American principles. These were not radicals or outsiders. They were men tasked with enforcing policy who could no longer reconcile orders with conscience. Filipino fighters, meanwhile, committed their own atrocities. American prisoners were tortured and killed. Some were buried alive, their deaths designed to terrify. By the later stages of the war, Filipino sharpshooters deliberately targeted medics, chaplains, and wounded soldiers. Brutality fed brutality, each side pointing to the other as justification. This was the war's moral collapse. Atrocities were no longer aberrations, they were symptoms. The conflict had slipped beyond the control of ideals and into the logic of vengeance. And once that line is crossed, no victory comes without a stain. By late 1900, the Philippine-American War had become two conflicts at once. On the ground, it was a grinding campaign of patrols, reprisals, and exhaustion. At home, it was a battle over truth, over whether the American public would see the war as it was or as officials insisted it should be. The American military leadership understood that the narrative mattered. Reports of torture, burned villages, and civilian deaths threatened to unravel public support. If the war could no longer be framed as benevolent occupation, it risked becoming politically untenable. So a second front opened, quieter but no less ruthless, a campaign to control information. General Elwell Stephen Otis, still a powerful voice despite mounting criticism, worked aggressively to suppress damaging accounts. Soldiers who spoke to journalists were reprimanded, reassigned, or threatened with court-martial. Official communiques emphasized progress, minimized casualties, and dismissed allegations of abuse as isolated incidents or enemy propaganda. The goal was not merely to deny wrongdoing, but to restore moral certainty. Yet the pressure was mounting. Congressional investigations proceeded. Newspapers continued to publish testimony. And within the officer corps itself, confidence in the war's direction was fraying. Even those committed to victory questioned the cost of achieving it this way. In December 1900, a significant shift occurred. General Arthur MacArthur replaced Otis as military governor. MacArthur was less concerned with appearances and more determined to end the conflict decisively. His solution was sweeping and severe. On December 20, 1900, he placed the entire Philippines under martial law. Civil authority was suspended. Military rule expanded. Searches, arrests, and punishments intensified. The aim was total control, cutting off guerrillas from food, shelter, and support so completely that resistance would collapse under its own weight. The policy accelerated the decline of the Filipino revolutionary movement. Already weakened by internal divisions and the assassination of Antonio Luna, the resistance struggled to coordinate under constant pressure. Supplies vanished, safe havens disappeared. Thousands of fighters were killed or captured. Civilians, caught between fear and survival, increasingly lacked the means to support the insurgency, even if they wished to. By early 1901, the balance had shifted decisively. Filipino forces had lost control of most of their territory. Leadership was fragmented. Morale was collapsing. The war, once fought with visions of independence, was becoming a fight simply to endure. Then came the moment that would symbolize the war's turning point. On March 23, 1901, American forces captured Emilio Aguinaldo himself. The operation was deceptively simple and devastatingly effective. American soldiers posed as prisoners, escorted by Filipino allies, loyal to the United States. They were welcomed into Aguinaldo's camp without suspicion. Once inside, the ruse ended. Aguinaldo was seized before resistance could form. There was no dramatic last stand, no martyr's death. Aguinaldo was exhausted, physically, emotionally, and politically. He had watched years of struggle end in famine, camps, and mass death. The revolution he had led was breaking apart before his eyes. On April 1, 1901, Aguinaldo swore an oath recognizing American authority over the Philippines. Weeks later, he issued a proclamation urging his followers to lay down their arms. For many Filipinos, the announcement felt like the end of an era. For others, it felt like betrayal forced by despair. The organized revolutionary government had collapsed, but the war itself was not yet finished. Emilio Aguinaldo's surrender marked the collapse of the revolution's central leadership, but it did not bring immediate peace. For many Filipinos, laying down arms felt impossible. Too much blood had been spilled, too many villages burned, too many families displaced. The war had ceased to be only about independence. It had become about survival, vengeance, and memory. After Aguinaldo's proclamation urging resistance to end, American officials declared the rebellion effectively broken. In reality, fighting continued across the archipelago. In some regions, former revolutionaries refused to accept Aguinaldo's authority to surrender on their behalf. Others believed that submission would only deepen exploitation and humiliation. General Miguel Malvar emerged as the most prominent figure to carry on the struggle. Operating with dwindling resources and exhausted troops, Malvar launched a final series of attacks throughout 1901 and early 1902. His campaign lacked the scale and coordination of earlier phases, but it demonstrated that resistance was not merely the product of leadership, it was rooted in lived experience. The American response was relentless. Under martial law, patrols intensified, food denial policies tightened, arrests increased. With each passing month, resistance became less sustainable. Villages that had once supported fighters could no longer do so without risking annihilation. Starvation and disease did what bullets often could not. On April 16, 1902, Malvar surrendered. With that act, organized resistance against American rule in the northern and central Philippines effectively ended. President Theodore Roosevelt, who had assumed office after the assassination of William McKinley, declared the war over just months later. On July 2, 1902, Congress passed the Philippine Organic Act, establishing a civilian government, a Bill of Rights for Filipinos, and a path, vaguely defined towards self-governance. Roosevelt proclaimed general amnesty for those who had participated in the conflict. Officially, the war was finished. In practice, violence lingered. In the southern Philippines, Muslim communities collectively known as the Moros continued to resist American authority in what became known as the Moro Rebellion. Their struggle would last more than a decade, culminating in devastating battles such as Bud Bagsak in 1913. Only then did the United States achieve full military control of the archipelago. American rule over the Philippines would last another 33 years. Roads were built, schools opened, and new political institutions introduced. Yet these developments unfolded within a framework of colonial dominance. Economic exploitation continued. Racial hierarchies persisted. True sovereignty remained deferred. In 1946, after another catastrophic war, this time against Japan, the Philippines finally achieved full independence. By then, generations had lived and died under foreign rule that began with a promise of liberation and hardened into occupation. The Philippine-American War left no simple legacy. It exposed the dangers of imperial ambition disguised as benevolence. It forced Americans to confront the limits of their ideals when applied beyond their borders. And it inflicted wounds on Filipino society that would take decades to heal. This was not a forgotten war by accident. It was forgotten because remembering it requires honesty about power, about race, about the cost of empire. To study it is not to condemn a nation, but to understand it. History's value lies not in comfort, but in clarity.